All right, welcome back. We are WEBD6201 in the winter 2021 semester, and it's week 13, our last week of class, and it's client-side scripting. And we're going to do one part of this one, so this is pretty cool. What we're going to be doing is, yeah. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing authentication with Jwt. But first, let's see where we're at. So we're right at the bottom of our semester. Again, the last week of class. As I sent out earlier this week or yesterday, where there is no ICE 12, I'm going to be taking the ones that you guys have done already and use those. So no ICE 12. And last week we talked about authentication with Passport and Mongoose, and we did a bunch of stuff, restructured our app using an MVC structure and so on. We did all kinds of stuff, so that was really great. The stuff that we put together last week, and I've more or less given you everything you need for Lab 4, and I'm going to review Lab 4 requirements again at the end of this class. Okay, so this week we're going to just talk about security considerations and some of the things that we face when we develop a web application, especially when we make it so that there is a separate front end from the back end. And I sent a little note out to kind of explain that again a little yesterday, and how we can mitigate that with using something called JWT, right? So that's what we're doing. And then just a reminder that Lab 4, the final lab, is due this Friday at midnight. I also went over the test. Some of you didn't hand in the test. It's unfortunate for the last test, but otherwise, I think most of them were done fairly well. All right, so let's think about what this is. What is JWT? We're going to be talking about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about, web tokens versus session and what that looks like. Okay, so JSON Web Token, or JWT, sometimes people call it Jwt. I guess it's the way it's written for short, is basically a standard for passing something called claims in from one server to the other. So what I want you to consider is you may have a claim, quote unquote, and the claim might be made up of, username, password, all those kind of things. And you pass that to the server. It provides you with a token. And then from there, you have the ability for you to log in. And it's different than session-based authentication in that there's a challenge with this, with sessions, when you go from one server environment to the other. And it's great for things like Microservices Architecture, as well as where your server backend and your front end are separate services. And a good example of that is if we use something like on the front end, like Angular. Angular is a good example of that. So let's say, suppose we're using Angular on the front end, or React. Let's say these are the two most common frameworks, plus Vue. Let's pull those ones up again. We can't forget these. These are the three big ones, I guess. So Angular, React, and Vue. Again, my go-to is Angular. Some people, a lot of people, most people like React, I would say, because that's kind of another thing. And I think this is where you would go next, guys. After this course, I think it'd be a great opportunity for you guys to delve into Angular or React or Vue, one of those front-end frameworks, if you're interested in web application development. But you have this on the front end, and it's a separate service, let's say, and then you have Express and Node on the back end, Express middleware, Node as a server. And how do you communicate between two different, endpoints, if you will, and maintain state? So I want to send information from one server to the other. It's not you logging in. The servers are communicating with each other now. All right. How do I do that? Well, we use JWT, JavaScript Web or JSON Web Tokens. Let's talk about that a little bit more. So we have a token that gets created. It looks like something like this, right? And this token basically is a hashed or hashed information about your claim. And the claim usually is some kind of subject. So let's say, and then the name of the person, as well as a so sorry, Nicholas says, this is still being recorded. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So let's suppose you have you have your name and your, some other information about the user that's coming in and so on. And what you really want to do is you want to kind of encrypt that information as a token. This is your token itself, and it gets stored on the system as you move forward. So that's kind of what happens. That's your what JWT looks like. And claims, when we talk about claims, right, themselves, they are definitions or assertions made by a certain party or object, saying things like, I am this person, this is my identity, kind of thing. And excuse me, whoo, yeah. And so what we want to pass in is maintain identity. So let's say I say I'm Tom, and I want to log into this front end server, and this front end server is going to communicate and pass my token around, so who I am and so on, from an authentication perspective, to the back end, and say, okay, Tom needs information, as an example, from the back end, and the back end will pass things back to the front end, and the front end will return views back to me. That's how it works. So the thing is, and again, I want to remind you guys the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is identity. Who are you? Authorization is what can you do, right? So that we're not talking about authorization right here. We're talking about authentication, which is identity. We want to maintain identity between different servers, right? And sometimes you have more than two. Actually, a lot of times now with microservices, you might have multiple servers or multiple endpoints that you want to pass around your token to. Because again, what we want to do is we want to create one with microservices architecture. And again, we haven't talked about this too much, but I want you to think about what we've done this semester. This semester, we've created a monolithic application. Right, if you think about it, which is like all in one. We have a front end, we have a back end, everything is one place, and it's like we have a authentication service, we have a service that shows us our contact list. These are all services, and these services are kind of wrapped into one application, right? And nowadays, what we can do is we can decouple those things into smaller little services, and we call them microservices. And what we do is we allow the services to communicate with each other through some kind of queue. All right, and that's how it works. Almost like a messaging queue is what it is. And the message queue's got to carry forward our tokens from one service endpoint to the other so we can maintain state and security. And the way to do that is with JWT. All right, so the main purpose is to transfer these claims between two parties or two servers, if you will, and that's what the job is of JWT. Other practical applications include, like we said, authentication, authorization. You can use a JWT for authorization because you'll pass in the claims inside of it, but really it's mostly used for authentication. Federated identity, that means identity across the framework or the network. That is totally fine. You could use client-side sessions and client-side secrets. You could do those things as well, as in stateless sessions. That's something that they can be used for as well. So, so a little bit of history. So the JSON Object Signing and Encryption Group, or JOSI, was formed in 2011. So that's when it started off, and their objective was to create a mechanism, again, for protecting, an identity and a signature as it moved from one server to the other. And then by 2013, things got ratified, and they created this, the service JWT. Now, usually what you want to go to when you look for JWT online, and if you want to look for documentation, is something called Auth. So if I go to JWT documentation, if you actually look at that, it'll take you here. So this is the, the actual site. So about JSON Web Tokens. It talks about how to use them and how to install them and stuff like that. This is where it is. And the other thing to notice that it's crafted by Auth or Auth 0, right? That's what it's called. And Auth 0 right now, what they have is a series of basically building blocks to create things like a backend API. They also talk about how to craft a single page application and so on. Lots of really cool information here from Auth. And Auth, it also includes additional information. And like we said, there's a bunch of APIs that it comes with, not just tokens, but other things. Okay, so really cool stuff. And that's where we get the documentation for JWT. All right, so this is where it is. And JWT, again, it's there's kind of, it talks about the structure, and there's a couple of pieces to it. There's a header that we're going to talk about before, a payload, and a signature, and that's what we're going to get into right now. Let's go into that. And usually it goes like this: so header, payload, signature. Okay. So let's get into that part right there. All right. So so one of the things we want to get into is so we have client-side data, and that's what these stateless sessions are. And the biggest problem with client-side data is they're subject to something called tampering, right? So we have a bad actor potentially, and that bad actor or malicious user, they want to tamper with the token or information that you're going to save, kind of on the client. And if they have access to that, they can spoof your identity and they can access a server. And this is the problem with using cookie-based authentication. So because cookies are saved on the client side. So what we want to do then is we want to sign these, the sessions, and the signature itself can help us differentiate if the user that's logging in is actually real or if the token has been tampered with. Okay, so we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So let's take a look at the idea of a shopping cart. So the left side here, as an example, is the server, and the right side is your user. I know it's kind of hard to see. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see it a little bit better. So let's suppose we have a user. The user sends in through unmodified data through the cloud, right? And usually we use some kind of cloud service like Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform. And then it goes through, it takes a look at the signed data, and then it accesses the server, and then it returns data out, back out to the user. That's how it usually goes. But what if there's a malicious user right in the middle? Can they modify the data somehow and able to access the backend? And you can see it says can't modify the data. And the reason for this is because it's difficult to tamper with the token. And the way it works is that the token system, it looks for that signature and it gets decrypted with the information you give it on the server. So it's kind of interesting. So the server has its own secret, and that acts as salt and pepper. Now that's where you don't want to expose those kind of things out in the API. And so, example, in our case, looking back at our structure, this is our structure, right, that we've kind of created. We have a server, and in the server we have a configuration file. And right now in our configuration file, we have a secret that's sitting here, but we wouldn't put this here in real life. What we would do is we would save this information inside of a server variable, and the server variable would protect this information so that it would not be exposed in any way, not even like this, out there, especially this, as well as anything like this, like username, password, access to the backend, all that kind of stuff will be protected and saved on a server variable. And same thing goes with any API information. If you're tapping into email backend, you're using an email relay service as an example, and the email relay service has an API key or whatever. Any API keys you would host on the server as variables, and those variables are not exposed. They're kind of, and I'm not talking about like here on my server. I'm talking about on the host, on the cloud. You would save them inside variables, and those variables aren't exposed ever. And that's how it would be. So you wouldn't even have this db.ts file. I mean, the only thing you would really have is the path. You'd have part of the path to connect to it because it needs some kind of information. But even that you can store in environment variables on the server. Okay, so that's really what we're talking about. And just back out here a little bit. So again, here are some security considerations that are ways of attacking a JSON web token. So it's called signature stripping. Okay, so signature stripping is something that people use when they know JWT is being employed. And what that means is they take a signed token, right? And they're constructed by these three different parts: header, payload, and signature. And then what happens is the signature is stripped away, and they try to access try to use the a token without a signature. So this is an example of one that's fully signed. This one's without, and you may have a malicious user that's going to try and send this this token. It's partly correct. It sends it to the server, and if the server is badly configured and accepts unsigned JWTs, right, tokens, then what ends up happening is the malicious user can actually get access to the server, right? So they take it, modify it, and send it back, and this is a bad thing. So this is definitely a security consideration because it could be a weakness if you're not configuring the server properly. Okay, so the other one is cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, very common attack type. And the way this works is there's an attempt to perform requests against sites where the user is logged in by tricking the user's browser into sending a request from a different site. Okay, now this is interesting. And guys, I keep on getting asked a lot. So should I have a virus, virus scanner, or some kind of intrusion detection system on my machine? And the answer is yes, especially when you go on sites that are, I would say, compromised. And you don't know when those sites are. As soon as you go to a site that's compromised, and this can be many different kinds of sites, remember what we learned this semester, that your information is up for grabs, right? Everyone knows, everyone can find out where you're coming from, right? So what's your IP address? What browser you're using? We can find that out, no problem. Your location, a lot of times geographically, we can find that out, and so on. There's a lot of information that you give up, because think about what's really happening when you go on a website. When you're on a website, you pass your information to the server and say, hello, I need some information from you. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you connect to the server, this is where you're vulnerable. Because if a server's been compromised, or if a server's been made to compromise you, right? So let's say it's got a false front end, as an example, and that false front end might look like it's legit, but actually the back end is all there to compromise you, take away your identity, and use that information to log into your bank or whatever. This is pretty bad. So it can act like it's you. And how does this work? So we have an example of a user, and a regular user goes and gets some kind of malicious image tag from a compromised server, right? And what ends up happening is that compromised server, it lifts information from you, like things like, other information that you have on your machine. And then it uses you as a relay to kind of access, this unsafe server. It's really crazy. So again, it's almost like it lifts information from you and becomes you as it accesses, other servers. And it can be really crazy what they can do with that stuff. So be careful about this. So again, how do we fix this? Well, we want to use short-lived JWTs. We don't want our tokens to last a long time. today I'm going to show you how a token can last for a week. Again, typically that's not a good idea. That's great for testing, but not great for what we want to do. What's the purpose of a web token if it's going to last an entire week on your system, right? It's got to last a very short time. Okay, so that's something that we want to. That's how you combat this cross-site request forgery or CSRF. Okay, the other one is cross-site scripting. All right, so this is kind of like SQL injection, where if you don't have good validation on the back end, let's say, for example, you have a comment section of a public site, like say a blog or something like that, and let's suppose your backend does not sanitize comments. So let's say you allow user to enter some comments, and they enter something with a script tag. Think about this for a second, right? Your comments come in, and you're getting a script tag, and maybe that script tag is going to give instructions to the backend to do certain kind of things. Those instructions can be used by a malicious user to compromise the server's security, right? And that is an issue. So again, that's very common. These are all common security considerations. So again, you have this malicious user, right, as an example, and they get the server to send arbitrary JavaScript to other users, and the user itself, who logs into the server like a regular user, logs into this vulnerable server where the server doesn't validate any comments or those kind of things, doesn't sanitize comments, and it harvests credentials from the local storage or cookies from a user and passes them potentially to a malicious user that can log in and use them later. Again, really bad. And you don't know that it's even happening. That's why, again, things like cookies and anything that's in your local storage, we use local storage temporarily for testing, but local storage and session storage are only good for really short, pieces or short time frames, and only temporary information. All right, we don't want to share anything, critical inside those two locations. They're there only for convenience, for state. That's all they're there for nowadays. And we use other kinds of things as well. Cookie authentication or passing cookies. And this is why when you go to sites now, any normal site, if you go there for the first time, it'll say, are you okay with us storing cookies on your machine? It's a new thing, and it's actually been brought into the law, I guess, across like worldwide when it comes to accessing things. That's one thing you always have to ask users when you create a web application. We haven't talked about that because that's not part of our course, but when you develop a web application, you should always ask the user, if you're storing cookies, right, is it okay? Are you okay with accessing this? And if it is okay, then you can use cookie-based authentication or cookie-based storage. If it's not okay, you can't store stuff on the user's system, and that's something you should ask them. That's part of our recommendations. So again, that's how cross-site scripting works. It's so this XSS type of attack, and it gets you access to vulnerable servers. So again, when it comes to JWT, again, we talked about this, 3 parts: header, payload, and signature. And the signature has this encrypted data that represents the user's authentication or perhaps even their authorization, depending on what's stored inside of the token. So what's in the header? The header carries claims about itself. So things like, hey, this is who I am, as an example. The payload is the user data. That's what it is, right? So anything that I want to pass over, if I want to pass in information about my, username, password, all that kind of stuff. And that's how it typically goes. Okay, so we're going to be using something called Passport JWT as a way of connecting our JavaScript web token or JSON web token with Passport, because that's what we're using, Passport and MongoDB, and we're using a local strategy. We're going to create another strategy called the JWT strategy to use with Passport instead of simply just using a local strategy. Okay. So Passport allows an option to store the user object in the request object instead of the session object. So this is 2 different things. Right now, we've been storing it in the session object, and we're using express sessions. But instead, what we want to do is store it in the request object. And this is where we want to demonstrate how to use Passport. So typically, what we don't want to use, we store the client normally stores the token locally in the local storage, But again, this only happens temporarily, and again, it's a signed token. It's not something that is going to be that's going to be held there very long. Okay, so it's not a cookie. Cookies can be stored for very, very long times. So how do we do it? Well, this is what we want to do. So there's no in-class exercise today, but one thing what we want to do is we want to try, and I want to show you how you start setting up your server as an API on the back end. All right, so I've kind of have our server from last week, and I've already put the link to the demo up online, just in case you wanted to, or you're interested in this kind of stuff. Hopefully you are. So what we want to do is configure our server. Let's do that. So I'm going to kind of get out of here, and the first thing I want to do is add additional packages to our server. So again, what we want to use, we're using Yarn. So we want to Yarn add CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing. A lot of times, even if I have the server, my server that basically serves up on different ports. So let's say, for example, my front end Angular or React is on port 3000, and my back end Express is on port 3500. Okay, let's just put this out there, right? And I want to communicate between one part of my server and the other. Sometimes we'll have this problem where we're using cross-origin resource sharing, and it'll come up as a security problem. And so we want to have the ability for the front end to talk to the back end. We need to add CORS in there. So Yarn add CORS. The other thing we want to add is passport JWT, and I think it's JSON Web Token. Those are the three, yeah. And then it's we don't have to use --, save. That's for npm. So those are the ones we're going to add, those three. And then what we want to do after we've added those three modules, we want to add some support for TypeScript, because we're going to be using TypeScript this whole time. By the way, guys, I have to tell you that using TypeScript is a real skill out there that's in demand. And if you put that TypeScript on your resume, it's going to go a long way in terms of getting you hired as a web application developer these days, for sure. All right, so next part is Yarn add at types, and we're going to do CORS at types / passport -jwt, and then at types / JSON Web Token. And we want to save that as --, dev, just like we normally did. So this is kind of the way we're going to do it. So there's passport JWT. We're getting support for this now, okay? And then we're going to press enter. We're going to get those dev packages in here, okay? And notice that my node modules is still showing red, and the reason for it is as soon as I install anything with Yarn, then the little fix we made in our passport local mongoose has been undone, right? Just letting you know. And even though we're not even looking for this, right, it's showing us that there's a problem here that got rewritten. Why? Because what it does is it goes through, and it's going to show an error anyway, but it goes through and it's only a type definition, which is a good thing, but it goes through and tries to fix this problem, right? Why? Even if in our tsconfig.json, I put a little area there that says exclude node modules. I don't want to recompile node modules. That can happen if you don't do that sometimes, but it doesn't matter. Node modules, because I'm using a type declaration files to give me code hinting, if there's a problem with it, which there is in that one module, then it's going to sign red. Don't worry about this. I'm not. And the reason for it is because we're not really using this. It's just for support. It's not going to affect our production. All right, so that is, you can see that went away once I got rid of it, because we don't care about it. All right, next is, and it's going to happen. Sometimes different people write node modules that we download for support compared to what we use for the front end. All right, so that's our compiler options. That's nice. Everything's great. And now let's add some stuff into our configuration file. So again, we have our config separated inside of our app.ts. And now what we want to do is we want to use a different, additional imports for we have modules for authentication, but now we want modules for JWT. Okay, so we're going to do an import, and it's going to be we're going to import CORS, again, cross-origin resource sharing. And we're going to say that CORS from CORS, right? This is the TypeScript way of doing things. And we're also going to say that we want to import passport JWT from passport JWT. So those are the kind of requirements. I also want to define two aliases, all right? Define JWT aliases. And the reason for this is just makes it easier for us to use, right? Whenever we define aliases in anything, you know, a lot of times what happens is like, look, here's local strategy. And instead of using passport.local strategy, it's just easier for us to use local strategy. So similarly with JWT, we want to kind of create two of them. So we're going to say let JWT strategy. That's going to equal to our passport JWT dot strategy. So notice that that is exposed. And we'll do the same thing with extract JWT, which is our passport JWT dot extract JWT. All right, so those are the things. So notice we have those two. Could we do it differently? Remember that we can use aliases, or with passport JWT, we can also add in additional things. Like for example, let's say, can I use extract JWT, you know, kind of, you know, by itself? Could you do this, right? Could I also use not just extract JWT, but strategy by itself? Yes, you could. You can do these things. Remember, we can kind of get passport JWT, but we can also get individual modules through what we've done before. But the problem with this is when I use passport JWT, let's suppose I say I want to do strategy. Which strategy is it? Is it the passport local strategy? Like there's a lot of different ones. And that's why it's difficult for me to do this, right? Because we have to specify which strategy we're using. And that's why because we have to be very specific, it's just good enough to do it this way. So that's why, yes, it's nice. And if we were in our own file, we could do that. But we're not in our own file. We have other imports we're doing, and they're very similar in terms of their wording. And that's why it's important to do it this way. Okay, so that is that's part of it. We did our passport local like we've done before, and we imported Flash. These are all good things. We're going to skip down now after we've done our configuration or initialization, if we will, or importing. We're going to skip down to just below. We've connected to Mongo and Mongoose right here. And then at the bottom, just before our session, as an example, we're going to add in our access to CORS. So the way it is we're going to say app.use, and we're going to use CORS, right? And again, CORS is cross-origin resource sharing. We're saying it's okay for our site to use CORS. That's what it does, okay? And whenever we do an app.use, what we're doing is we're attaching an extension, or we're extending our Express server to include additional functionality. We're actually attaching additional functions and so on to Express. And when we do this, we're actually initializing CORS as well. It's almost like, think about what we're doing here. We're using the CORS constructor, right, to create an anonymous object that's being housed inside of our app object. Our app object then will have access to the information, the functions that are used by CORS. Okay, that's how it works. Again, these are ways of making it work on the back end so that we don't have to do things like CORS is equal to a new CORS. We don't have to do those kind of things. So then we have this. Again, think about what we're doing here. db.secret, this would be in real life. This would come from an environment variable. But this is what we're doing here. We do our passport initialization as normal. Everything is good. And as we move forward into after we serialize and deserialize our user, this is where we add an additional configurations for JWT. And where we start is we want to create something called Jwt Options, which is going to equal, it's going to be an object. I mean, again, it's up to you how you do this, but I would say something like, I want to do Jwt options is going to be Jwt from request. And the from request is going to be, we're going to use extract Jwt, like we configured that alias earlier, and then from header as bearer token. Okay, so what this is we're going to get a bearer token that's going to be stored in the header of our, remember, we have three pieces, header, payload, and so on, and signature. Those three, what we want is the from request, if you will, is going to be stored as a header bearer token that we're going to be using. And that's what this basically states. And the next one is, when we're configuring JWT, is we want to make the secret or key, that's what it's called, secret or key. We can make that equal to, we don't want to make this equal. In fact, we want to make it something like this as we're defining our object. We want to make this equal to dbconfig.secret. Okay, so that's why we want to kind of get that information. That's our secret. Again, it's really simple. Our secret is actually some secret. It even tells you right there. So it's not really that complex. The secret also can be something that you encrypt. You can download additional packages to make this a unique ID. UUID is a package we can use as well. I'm not going to do that here, but there are other packages you can download when it comes to security. So there's something called, if I go npm UUID, UUID is another package, and what it does is it creates an RFC 4122 UUID, so it's used for encryption and for authorization. You can install UUID, and the way it works is it creates a unique ID identifier for your application. So something like this, right? And that unique identifier is your secret, and it's generated for you. So this is a much better secret than some secret, right? It's way better. So we're not doing that right now because, again, when it comes to security, we're just scratching the edge of our course. We don't want to go outside of what we're doing here. Even what I'm showing you is beyond the scope of what we're supposed to kind of do this semester, but I want to talk about it because it's so common and you're going to see it in the workplace. All right, back to what we're doing. Back to the configuration. So yes, we could, that's what we're using this, kind of config secret as an example. And once we've got that, now the typical way of doing it is we want to create a strategy variable, a local strategy for JWT, and we're going to say that is equal to a new JWT strategy object. And the JWT strategy object is going to include the JWT options we just defined up there. Plus, we're going to pass in something called JWT payload, right? As well as a done object. And the done object is going to carry forward all our information. So let's do that. Okay, so that is, and we do this here in the configuration file in app.js, or app.ts, but we can always do this kind of stuff somewhere else. If we, for example, what I've also seen is, remember, we can modularize. We've been modularizing this whole second part of semester, right? Where we can create yet another module, and inside of that module, we can have all of our JWT kind of initialization that happens there, and we just import it. Nothing wrong with that either. So if I want to do something like strategy is equal to whatever that module is called, and I do all this stuff somewhere else where I kind of hide it away, it's okay. It's okay to do that. It's actually a good practice. Okay, next, what we want to do is we want to find the user and return the payload. So we're going to say user.findById, because user, remember, user has been defined here in our application. We want to pass in JWT payload, right? So this is our payload that we're passing into the user, and the payload includes an ID, an identifier for the user, right? That's what it does. And we're going to use something called a promise, which looks like this. So after the payload, we find the user. If we find the user, then we want to say that we want to look at the user object and we want to return done. When we return done, we're going to pass in null and the user object itself. So that's kind of when the user has been found. Okay, so we find the user. We're looking in the system for the ID of the user that's contained inside the payload. Remember that the payload is going to be decrypted here. That's what this strategy does for us. It takes a look because user find by ID. If you remember what that is accessing our MongoDB server, and it's passing in an ID as a filter, right? That says something like, I'm looking for this ID, and that comes from the payload. So the payload is something that has been decrypted at this point, and we're using it to find the user. After we find the user, that's fantastic. We're going to return the user back out. That's what this strategy does. And then, but what about if we don't? We can have something called a catch. Right here, again, this is using promises where we catch the error and we want to return the error instead of returning the user. So we're going to return the error in this case, and we're going to say there's no user, the user is false. And this structure, this difference between here and this is the way that Jwt works. Okay, so that's part of, kind of our configuration. Then we're going to add this configuration on top of passport. So notice we've gone and done passport.use strategy. This is our auth strategy. We're also going to use our new strategy right here. So this is something that we've defined. Again, you can call this, instead of strategy, you can call it Jwt strategy, but it's it's been used everywhere, right? So we just call it strategy. And that's really the configuration. That's it for the configuration on the app.ts. All right, so that's the first part. Let's put this up on GitHub. Again, you can see this live later on. We'll say git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say added support for Jwt, and we'll say git push. Okay, so that pushed everything, all that configuration stuff out to the server. And again, we haven't had a chance to test it right now, but there isn't anything to test because we haven't implemented what this would look like. So right now, it's not going to hurt us. Nothing has changed on our end because even though we've got this strategy and we've used it, we're not accessing it in any way. And remember that where that's being accessed is when we log in and where we register. Those kind of services is something we have to address. So if I go back to where that's being done inside of our controllers now. Remember, we have two controllers, our index controller and our contact list controller. So if I go into our index controller, you can see here that we're using passport and we're using our model from our user model, right, as an example. And then we have a new little utility function called user display name. We're going to add another utility function there in a second. But that's what we use user display name to get this information. One thing to note, and I'm going to say this again, is you could certainly make this entire thing into a class, right? And this class could have all of these methods, as opposed to you exporting multiple objects. You can export the class, and the class would be almost like a namespace for all of these methods. So, for example, it would be called the index controller class. I just want to mention that again. It's very common. You'll see that as you move forward. If you become an web application developer, you may see that kind of structure. Okay, so in the controller then, which is in the index controller, what we want to do is we want to enable and configure Jwt to work. So remember what we're doing. We want to, and I'll put it in here right now, but we'll talk about how this can be configured differently. So I want to enable Jwt. All right. So the way to do that is to say import Jwt from JSON Web Token this time around. So this is the other side of things, right? So the first part is I want to make a local strategy. We create a configuration on our app, .config, which is what we've done. And now we're going to use that configuration with JSON Web Token to make sure it works. And where that's being used, of course, is inside of our login and register pages. So if we skip down here, right now, all of our pages we render something, right? Why? Because we're using Express and our EJS view engine as a front end. But imagine if we don't even use these views and we're not even using Express. And this is why we don't have an in-class exercise this week, because we don't have a front end really except for EJS. And so we don't really need JWT, but I'm showing you how to set this up instead. So here's our display login page. Our display login page, kind of says, okay, log in, please. That's what this does. And then we have our display register page. These two don't change. Where it really changes is in our processing. Okay, so this is where it really changes. So if I go down to our process login page, we really have two main pieces. One part is Passport Authenticate, and that accesses our local strategy. This is the strategy right there. And that local strategy basically goes in and uses your username and password to log in. And this login component right here, we use the request object to log in. So similarly to what we're doing right here, instead of returning and redirecting us back to our contact list, right, we want to use JWT for this. So how does this look when it comes to logging in? Okay, so remember we have a header and a payload. So the first thing is, and I'm just going to configure this, right? And I'll talk about what is going to be used and what can't be used. So first we want to kind of describe a payload. So our payload would look something like this. It would be an object, and our object is going to contain an ID, which is going to come from our user object. Remember, we've just logged in. We've got our user, right? User information. And we're going to take that user object and we're going to encrypt it. We're going to take the ID from the user object and encrypt it as a payload ID. Okay. We're also going to take the display name. We're going to make a display name object, and we're going to get the user.displayName, because remember our user object, which is a request.user, has a display name. Same thing with our username, right? Which we're also going to have our user.username. It's 1 underscore before ID, okay? And then finally, our email address, that's equal to user.email address, okay? So that's where that comes from. So this is our payload. This describes our payload, and it basically is all the information, the data that we want to store in our token. Okay, so we're doing it here, and we're going to talk about where we can do it somewhere else for now, but let's just go through this. So we have our payload, and then what we want to do is we want to create an auth token. So const, we're going to make something called an auth token, and the auth token we're going to use JWT now. So JWT.sign, we're going to sign the payload, right, that we just created with our DB secret. So I don't have DB config. If I go DB config here in this file and I go secret, right? Remember what this will do, right? It can look for our app.ts. Take a look how it's trying to figure things out for me. But we don't really have DB config installed. So it's telling us, hey, Tom, there's nothing like that. Did you want to fix this somehow, right? Doesn't know how to find it. So at the top here, not only do we have to use JWT, but we also have to import from or star. Remember how we did this? Star as DB config from, and then we have to figure out where that is. We're sitting inside of controller's index. We have to go up one, and then inside config, and then inside DB. That's where it lies right now. By the way, maybe it shouldn't be DB. Maybe it should be its own. Instead of our DB config, maybe we'll have another configuration for our auth configuration, and that's where you get the secret from. So we could separate that for sure. All right, so very cool. We've done that now, and if we go back, that is the first part. So we've got our payload, we sign it with our secret, and then what we want to do is we want to configure it. So the configuration piece is right here, and this is kind of our options that we're actually looking at right now. I could create a separate options object to put in here, just like I've got our separate payload. And what that would look like So this is Jwt Options. Let's just do that now. So we'll say const Jwt Options again. And this is local. And that's equal to an object. And what we want to do in the object is I want to put in something that's called expires in. So expires in, that is the option, right? And now this is where we want to configure how long the Jwt token will last. And here's the week. So it's basically a number of milliseconds. So if I want to say last a week, which is not a good idea, we would be something like this. This would be 1 week, okay? So then I can take this Jwt Options object and I can pass it into our, here inside of our sign, our signature, right? So our signature needs all these 3 parts. So that when we sign in, right, it needs, if you notice what it says, it needs a payload, right? It needs a secret, and it needs options, okay? And then returns a string, and that string is the auth token. So that is the token, and let's output that for a second. So if we do a console log, auth token, we can see what that will look like, right? What is that going to look like for us when we actually do it? Again, none of this is going to disrupt our logging in and logging out because this is done in the request login. So request login checks the user, does it exist? And all it does is it gets that auth token. And that auth token is something that we're going to pass in to the front end. So this is something we need to do. We need to be able to pass into the front end. But we can't do that. There is no front end. Right now, our front end is Express and EJS. If we had Angular, instead of doing a request.redirect, we wouldn't do, or response.redirect, we wouldn't do it. It would look something that looks like this. Let me show you, and I'll remove this in a second. So this is if we had a front end like Angular or React or Vue, right? Then what would we do? It would look like this: return res.json, okay? Return res.json, and we would pass in the body of our object we're going to return. We're going to actually return a message, right? Where we're going to say success is going to be true. We've logged in at this point, right? Our message that we're going to pass into the front end is going to be a friendly message that says our user logged in successfully. We're going to use that with Connect Flash, right, as an example. And then we can pass in the user information that we want, which is, and I want you to think about this, our user information is just our payload, right, which is basically our user ID, our display name, our username, and an email address. So we can just pass in payload. Remember, payload here is encrypted. Payload here is just the user information. That's all we're going to pass in, right? So that is our payload, and then followed by, we're going to continue, right? So this is inside of our, the user object itself, followed by our some kind of the token itself, right? Sorry, I just want to make sure I get this correct. Because that's inside of the token. Yes, inside of the token, which is our auth token. There we go. So that is the information we're passing to the front end. And we're doing it in one line here, but that's what it looks like. So request JSON, response JSON. And when we do a response.json, we can't do this. See, we can't do both. Can't do both these things, right? And if I do this and I redirect, you're going to, for a brief second, you're going to see all this inside the browser. We don't do that. We're seeing it on the front end. If we were going to use this, our system as an API, this is what it would look like. Okay, but we're not using it as an API, so we're going to just comment it out. I'm just showing you the code. This is actually what the code would look like if we're going to use it. And if we were using it, then we would comment this line out because we wouldn't redirect anywhere. The redirection, all the pages and all that stuff, the front end would be controlled by Angular or React or Vue. It wouldn't be controlled by us on the back end anymore. All right, so that is how you would log in. Similarly, when you register, that's another place where we actually save that information, right? We want to be able to register you and log you in. And so it's the same kind of process. So we have a new user. Here's our new user object. None of that's changed. We have user.register. And in our user.register, we do all this funky stuff where we check to see if the user's registered and so on. And then, we come to this point where we say, if there's an error, then right now we res render, right? We res render our options. Otherwise, what we do is we want to authenticate you. That's what we do. We authenticate you otherwise. So this is our else area right here. Because if you notice, there is no else statement because the return basically precludes the else. So we don't need to do an else here. So this is where we return passport authenticate. We want to authenticate the user. Well, we wouldn't do that here if we were using JSON Web Tokens, right? Because I wouldn't do the authentication step here. Instead, what I would do is I would pass in that the user is registered correctly. That's all we would do. So this is enough, but we pass that information back to the front end. So what it would look like, again, if we had a front end, which we don't, like Angular, React or Vue, right? Then we would do something like this. We would say return res.json. So we're going to say the JSON object. We're converting things to JSON. We're going to have a message that includes a success property, which is true. And we're going to say the message is the user registered successfully, right? So that's the message we're going to send across to the server side. Okay, that's it. We wouldn't do this part. We wouldn't automatically authenticate them. We would just do the registration piece. Okay, so that is the thing we would do if we were having a front end. And routing is where all the front end pieces come into play. One more piece. The last part is our logout. So logout, we would perform our logout like normal. Everything is normal, right? It's just we're carrying forward a token. And then what we want to do is we want to, instead of a res redirect, again, I'm going to put the same message if we had a front end, because we don't have a front end right now. If we had a front end like React and Vue, right, then what we would do is we would just do a res.json. Let's copy that object here. So this object here, return res.json, right? Actually, just this part. That's all we need. And this part right here, res.json, would be we send out a message that says user logged out successfully, logged out. Okay, that's the message. And then we wouldn't have this piece because we wouldn't redirect anywhere because the redirection happens in the front end. So that is if we had it. That's how it would look. And in fact, anywhere you see a res render, anywhere you see a res render is where you put in a res.json, right? So let me give you an example of that. What that would look like if I was doing stuff. Let's do a couple of them. If I was going to convert my Express site as an API, right, as an example, then any of this display homepage, I would never display the homepage inside with EJS, right? We're not going to render anything anymore. Instead of res rendering, what we're going to do instead is we're not even going to have these views, right? And the routing isn't even going to come here. So what I mean by that is on the router, right? So in our index route, we're literally going to comment out, right, anything that accesses any of these views, right? Because we don't need them anymore. The routing would happen on the front end a lot of times for our stuff because remember we're using a single page application, and our single page application would ignore any of the routing that's happening here. Okay, all that routing would happen on the front end. Okay, so that's the difference between one and the other. Okay, so far we've done everything inside of here. And one piece, sometimes what we need to do is we need to be able to get that. Right now we've locked everything into here when it comes to generating an auth token. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're doing it in here. And let me show you what that looks like. So I'm just gonna see what the auth token looks like by running nodemon. So if everything goes well, nodemon should work. It's right now it's connecting to the cloud MongoDB Atlas, right? There it is. And let's just use nodemon here locally with localhost. Okay, so there it is. I want to log in like normal. Nothing's going to change, right? None of this has changed. It just creates a token for us. So I log in. And then what I do is I've got some access here. See, I can see some people went up here and modified my contacts. That's great. Good practice. But notice on the back end, now there is our token. There's our token, right? And that's what we've done here. When we've outputted the token, our console log, that's what our token would look like. Again, notice that the pieces that are there, this is your header, right? This is your payload, right? And this is your signature. Okay, that's what the token would look like. Okay, as an example. And that token is going to be stored. It's going to be sent to the front end, Angular, let's say, or Vue or React. And that token is going to be used to say, okay, I've got a signed token. It looks like the backend's got a user that's been authenticated. Show them the pages. That's what this will do. Okay. So that's what our auth token looks like. And that's great if we were going to lock it in here. But what we may want to do instead is we may want to do a separate area, as an example, where we have our almost like a generate token, kind of object, if you will. All right, a generate token object. So we have right now we have a payload right here when we're logging in, and we're getting the user information. So this user is actually our logged in user, right? So is there a way, could you figure out a way, and I'm a challenge for you guys here before we stop for the day, is there a way to take this information, our user information, and we want to kind of use this, right, when we kind of create a utility. Remember our utilities right now, if I look at in our index.js, there's two pieces, there's two of them. One of them is this user display name that we're using. And the other one is an auth guard. And the auth guard basically says, hey, if I'm authenticated, then do whatever it is, right? How do I get my user information out here? Like, what do I do with that? It's a function, right, that I want to kind of create. So let's consider what we've done already inside. And I'm just showing what we would do for compartmentalization, right? Again, just so we can remove some of this stuff. And we can use that generated token in multiple places, not just in one place. Here, obviously, it's a good place because we're logging in. But what if I wanted to redo this signature stuff somewhere else, right? Well, remember, we need to include Jwt as well as dbconfig. So at the top, instead of putting in this here, let's not do this here. Again, I'm going to copy these pieces and put them inside of our utility, our util index.ts. So up at the top where we do our imports, I'm just going to put those pieces in there as well. Okay. Right now it looks like they're, kind of grayed out. And we're going to make a new function. We're going to export. And we're going to call this function generate token. So, and generate token, again, is going to pass, we're going to get a user object from this generate token because we don't know what the user object is. All right. Now let's think about what this user object is in a second, right? So you can help me create this, this application. This is the challenge, right? So here's our function, but remember, we can't just do this. We need to have some kind of object. We can't make it any, right? So how do we get the user object? What would you say? You've learned a lot about TypeScript. How would I get the type that we need for the user object? What do you think? Well, okay, so let's go Not a lot of thoughts there. Let's go back into our index controller and let's hover over it, right? I mean, no problem. Let's hover over this. So if we go down into that process login page, where is that user object coming from? Well, it says user object is of type any. So this is something that it could be done. We're going to pass in a user, and the type here is going to be of type any. Why? Because we are configuring this user the way we want. Okay. We haven't really specified what type it is, and login only takes a user. Now we could make it an express user. Okay, but guys, just warning, if we make it an express user, right, then that could be, because that's what this says here. This is user, right? User is any. User is any, right? But if I look at the login says the user type is of type express user. So I could, I'm just putting it out there, I could try and configure this so it is an express user. I could say that this is an express user, right? But we're going to have issue. We can do this, definitely. There's not a problem with this. Okay. So that is something that we can do for sure. And we don't want to do it this way. We want to make this, think about what this is going to return for us. Generate token needs to return some kind of object. And remember what the object is going to be. What token are we going to return? If I want to return something created here and return it, let's go back up to here. What is this token? Auth token is just a string. That's where it's going to be. So instead of having all this here, we're going to take this and put it somewhere else. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So this is going to return a string. Okay. That means we need to return something out that comes out of here. Our body or our payload is something we want to bring in there. So again, we'll go in here and we'll steal this part. And we'll steal this part, these two pieces, and bring them back into our code here. So in here, we're defining two pieces, a payload, and this is where we get into trouble, right? Once I say user is an express user, user doesn't know about ID, it doesn't know display name, it doesn't know any of these things, right? But if I say that the, it's the user, it's a request user, that's what it is, and the user is of type as a user document, well, that could be information about what we get, right? User document might include all those pieces because user document, if you notice, has a username, an email address, and a display name. Okay, those are the things that user document includes. So we're going to revert this back to any. And when we do that, once we do any, again, we don't want to always do that kind of stuff. But what it does, it takes away the errors. And any basically says that any type of user will take in. We'll configure the user. We'll assume that in this case, when we do any, I was going to push this out there to you. Any means don't use TypeScript. That's what it means. Okay. Yes, Nick. So then when we come to this part, once we've done this configuration piece, now we want to return the token. And so we're going to return out some kind of object from here. All right, one of these things. We have to return something. So again, if I go back to here, I want to return this piece. So I'm going to take this piece out of here, copy it, and go back out into my code, and I'm going to put it here, right? So, oops, I'm going to put it here, okay? And that is my payload. So that is the thing I'm going to return. So I'm actually taking that little, piece out. I'm generating a token right here, but I need to pass in a user information. Whatever that user information is, I'm going to take that user. The assumption is that the user is going to have an ID, a display name, a username, and an email address. Those things that is how my user is going to be configured. All right. The other thing to think about is when I configure this in my user object. So this is in my model. Here's our model for user. Just want to show you this. Our user model has username, email address, display name, and we've also configured a user document type that could include something like an ID. So if I wanted to, let's suppose I said my user document also includes an ID underscore ID. Think about this, which is also of type string. All right, so that's something that is definitely something we can do. We can say that hey, we could do this as well. And when we do this, then we don't, we don't stop using TypeScript. We actually define a user document. That's our type. That's the one we want. But I'm just going to put it out there that if you request a user document, it has to be an incoming user document. And I'll show you that in a second as well. So could I do a user document here? Can I make this a user document? You could, right? Because ID, display name, all that stuff, it's part of the user document. Look, it kind of takes all that information, right? Yay, awesome, right? But is it going to configure things properly later? So we'll leave this here for a second and we'll come back here. You'll see that they may not work. All right, so this is our generate token method and it's inside of a function. We may need to use this in other places, right? So, and that's why, we don't want to just do it on login. We may want to do it other times as well. So let's go back into our index controller and let's replace this part here with that little function. How do we do that? Well, at the top, instead of us enabling JW2 here, we have our util functions. So we'll get rid of all this, right? And then what we want instead is user display name as well as our generate token. So there's generate token. That's now a function we can use. And then as we come down in here, right, instead of using this payload and blah, 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 we can just get rid of all this stuff. And we can simply say that, which makes more sense to us, that const auth token is equal to, we want to pass in the generate token. We want to pass in a user, which is part of a user document. And if I do this now, it's going to work. Okay, so this is the thing that passes in, right? And it should still generate an auth token. So auth token is this thing that's being generated here, and we're using this generate token method to do it. Okay, let's see if this still works. So save everything. We'll say go back to here. Yes, we're nice. And go back out to our application. We'll log out for a second, and let's log back in. And let's see, we're able to log in, no problem. That means there's no issues. And when we come back to our app, we still see our beautiful little token, and this is great, okay? So generate token, this is definitely a better way of doing it. Why? As long as we pass in a user object, as an example, we can generate a token, and we may want to generate tokens or regenerate tokens multiple times, right, depending on the action that we're taking, okay? So examples of this would be, let's suppose I'm doing back-end routing, right, as well as some front-end routing, right? When I request, when I do a user authentication, right, as an example, right, what I want to do when I respond JSON, right, where I respond with a user payload and a token, this auth token, instead of doing it separately like this, anytime I do an auth token like this, I can pass in, generate token. And generate token, passing in the user object is perfectly fine right here. So I can actually pass it right in here. Instead of having an extra variable, I can just go generate token user right here. Right, again, it's just tighter. And it makes this more readable as well, as opposed to try and figure out what's happening. We're generating a token. It's our little object we've made. By the way, this idea can be carried forward into all the things we've done to really decouple and componentize our application. And why is that? I'm going to leave you with this thought because it's easier to test, right? If I have a problem getting a token, then I know there's a problem here or here. One of the two problems. Either the users are incorrect, I'm getting a wrong user, or my token generation function is just not working. Okay, one of those two pieces, right? But whereas if otherwise, I'm going to have an error that comes up and it's going to say passport authentication problem. We don't know what the problem is, but it's not authenticating right. Okay, so that's how it works. This is our we can put it inside of there. And it's the same thing if we want to now authenticate after registration. So registration, remember we couldn't do anything before. I couldn't do registration because I didn't have the token at this point, right? I had to just res, JSON and say, well, we registered correctly. But what if I want to authenticate? I want to do this piece. I want to authenticate properly. Well, we can simply do a passport.authenticate, right? We can sign in as an example. We can also specify that, by the way, when we authenticate up here, and if we're going to use JWT, what we want to specify for our sign-in, which is what this is, our local sign-in, right? Is I also want to specify that the before we actually have our callback function, that we want to that our session is false. We want to specify that as well. All right. Otherwise, this is going to use sessions. We don't want to use sessions because that's kind of goes against what we're doing this in the first place from, right? All right. So that is one piece, but we can actually use it down here is what I'm saying. So we can say that our generate token, now that we've got that function, when we log in and authenticate, we can do the same thing down in here, right? We can say that, okay, we want to authenticate. And once we've authenticated, we want to kind of do a request response. And when we have our callback function, right, inside our, instead of returning this res redirect, what we can do is we can do this piece again. We can return res JSON right here, right? We can do this piece down in here. If we didn't have it, we would do this, and our user payload, right, which is what we would have, right? That's something that also is something we can get information from, because our user is got to have a payload. Notice this new user. Look at that. It looks very similar to a payload, right? We have our username, email address, and display name. We would create a payload similar to what we did over here. That's one thing we need to do. Unfortunately, we can't do this payload every single time, but the user object would be something we get the payload from, right? So that's something that we would do. And then that payload, let me just go back to our thing here, because notice what we're saying is that the user payload is something that we would have. We would have this payload here, but the user information itself would come from the user object, this part. That's the user object. That is the payload if you think about it from, because that has everything that you need. Okay, so that's the user object. So here, user would just be user, right? Because this, we're encoding the JSON object right here. And the same thing goes with, instead of user here, this would be the user that we would have in, that we would get in from our object, our request user, this new user that we're getting here, right? So again, we have our username, email address, the display name. This is our new user. The only thing that's missing is that this thing is our ID, and the ID has been generated for us when we run into our new user. Our new user is a document that we want to use, and the new user includes all of this information plus information that it generates from here. So that's the only piece we're missing, that ID that we're going to get from the from the user. And so what we can do is we're just going to pass in the information in here that we need. Okay, so again, we can call this new user for now. Okay, and then this would be generate. Instead of having to do this auth token, we could just generate user right here. And the user, of course, would be, because we don't have a user object, the one thing that's missing in our user object is our ID. Same thing with this. Obviously, we want to pass in new user, but there is no ID right now that we have. We have to get that information when we do actually do the registration piece. Because once we've done registration, if there's no error, then we can do a lookup, right? Because we've already registered the user, we can look up the user, a quick lookup, and then we can get that information. So that's how it would look, kind of, on this end. It would look like something like this. Okay, but again, we don't have a front end, so we don't need it. But that's where that generate token method would come into play, because otherwise you couldn't do this automatically login user stuff. It wouldn't be possible, right? And this is the other place that we could use it. All right, so that is JWT at a very high level. I know I'm sorry I can't show you what it looks like with Angular on the front end. I can't show you what it looks like because Angular is a whole beast to learn by itself. And same thing with React. It's not so easy to do even with the time we have. So even if I had 4 more days to do it, it would just take too long. So that's why I haven't made you guys do an in-class exercise this week, but rather it's just an example of what you would do and what that thing would look like. All right, so that is how we do it. And what we want to do is we want to be able to validate our user every time. So every time we log in and stuff like this, and once we validate the user, we store that information. So the validation happens on the back end. This is the back end, right? But that token is something that we're going to pass to the other side, to the server, to say, hey, I've got the secure token. This is the signature, right, that we're going to be using. So when you go in on the back end, you're going to communicate back to me the thing I've given you, right? Whatever I've given you, that token is the thing that I need from you to make sure that you have, right? And then if you have that token, we're good. Okay, that's how it works, right? So then the front end would carry that information in the token, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of what that might look like. So I have a project that I worked on before on this that I can show you. So I'm going to see if I can get into the source of this project and see if I can actually get there where it doesn't look completely crazy, because otherwise it's going to be insane. Just give me one sec. And I want to show you what it looks like when we do so what it looks like here. So great thing is, and I really feel this is positive for you guys while I'm looking here. The real positive thing is, if I show you something that is, I'm pretty confident now anyway, if I show you something that is TypeScript, you should be able to look at it and go, I understand what's happening there. I get what's going on, right? Because the idea behind it is that, you see the functionality. You may not understand everything that's happening, but you'll get the gist just by looking at some TypeScript. So I'm just going to show you this, but it's from another package, another thing I've done. I'm almost there. I just want to make sure that I show you. I kind of zone in on that piece for the authentication, because otherwise it's useless. And because there's a lot of other stuff in there. So I'm doing it a soft line for a second, and then we'll get into it if we can. So all right. So in TypeScript, and I'm going to show you what it looks like for. So here's a repository that I've used before. And you can see that what's happening is this is what Angular would look like. Angular, when we start building things in, we import components and a bunch of stuff from Angular. So this is what it looks like, Angular core. This is using Angular 10, if I'm not wrong, back in the day. Now we're at Angular 12, but things move so quickly. So we have an auth component. This is our class as an example of something we can do. And one thing we haven't talked about is this keyword implements for TypeScript. Implements means I'm using an interface. And so on-init is an interface here. That's what this would look like, right? And when I have an on-init interface, I can really define my ng. ng stands for Angular, by the way. Angular on-init and what that would look like. And here's where I generate my new user object, okay? And then I do this authentication piece. So I kind of do, hey, this .auth, right, .authenticate, and I want to pass in this user and I'm subscribe. What the way it works with this is I'm subscribing to my authentication service. This is what it looks like. And here's where I say I want to store the user data from my authentication by getting this data token. There's my token, right? That data token, when I use store user data actually stores it inside of my local storage, right? So if I actually go there, right, you can see that it is connected to something called Webpack. And Angular, the complexity behind Angular, the biggest complaint about web applications nowadays is that, especially with Angular, is that it's so complex, right? Why? Because Angular uses something called Webpack. And Webpack is great. It's a bundler. And so far what we've been doing on our front end, when we made our own little single page application, right? What we did was we connected all of our front end pieces through scripts. So script, source, link for our CSS and so on. What Webpack does is it is a service that runs and it packages up all of your stuff together, and it connects all of your JavaScript and images and everything and creates static assets from all of these things. Like instead of making like, I don't know, a bunch of different files, it only creates like 4 of them. That's what it does. So it really compacts what it looks like. So that's what it does. But on the same token, it becomes a little bit more complex to look at. Okay. So again, here is what it looks like. Here's our index.js, right? And then we have a couple of pieces here. So we have index.js and bar.js in our source document. This is an example of what it does. We have our little configuration and we bundle it together. And now all we do is we call bundle.js, and bundle.js basically takes these two pieces together and it creates a little bundle for us, as opposed to accessing both these files separately. That's what Webpack does. And it's fantastic. It's used in large scale applications everywhere, including React and Angular. But on the downside, what it does is it adds another layer of abstraction. So example, when I look at this, it's actually being put together on the back end by Webpack. So that's where store user data is, from that side. And the great thing about GitHub right now is I can actually go and track some of this stuff where it comes from. So here's again what it looks like, our data.token, and where that token comes from. So that's how it stores stuff up. And this is our Angular authentication component, because Angular is built on components. We can also look at our auth guard. This is what an auth guard would look like on Angular on the front end. So we have auth guards on the back end, but we'd also have authentication guards on the front end. And all we're doing is we have a class called auth guard. And basically what we want to do is in our auth guard, we pass in our router and our authentication service. Remember, everything on the front end now in a more complex application is a service. And we want to basically say that if we're authenticated, that only then can you navigate to that particular site. Otherwise, you'll be basically navigated back to our authentication site, which is login. That's what it does. So a lot of the routing that Angular does in this example happens actually on the front end. Why? Because again, we don't have to go to the back end. Going to the back end is a round trip. And to save a round trip, what happens is, thanks, Nick. What ends up happening here is that it doesn't go to the back end, and so it does everything on the front end a little bit quicker. So that's an example of how it can be used. But from a configuration perspective, I want to show you one more thing, and then we're done for the day. I promise you that. Is inside of our module. And this is what our main module would look like, let's say in Angular, right? So here's your we've made a function here called Jwt Token Getter on Angular, on the Angular side. And there it is. Look at that, local storage dot get item, whatever the ID token, that's how it would be stored there. And we would do the same thing with set item. So whenever this is how we get the token. And when we get this token is stored inside of, we have a module, which is Jwt module, which is storing the function called Jwt Token Getter in here. And this is how we would get the token from our thing. So the token is going to be called, it's going to be stored in local storage with an ID of ID token. ID token is where that token I just showed you is going to be stored. Okay, so that's on the back end. And so our Jwt module is going to be, notice that it's coming from Auth. That's where it's coming from on the front end. Auth Angular Jwt, as opposed to on the back end where we're using Passport Jwt. Okay, so you can see the complexity, right? We have a whole other system on the front end that's as complex as we saw on the back end. But for large scale applications like this, Angular would be a good choice. For smaller applications, quick applications, and still you want to have a lot of functionality, then you may want to choose React or Vue. All right, that's it. I don't want to go into too much detail. I just wanted to show you how it could possibly be used and so on, but really we're not using this. So now the last piece that I wanted to talk about today, and I'm going to put this up on GitHub. So let's go back to that. So I'll say git add dot git commit -m as an example is completed Jwt config for app. Hit push. And you have an idea of what that looks like now. Okay, so that's in the GitHub repo that I made today. Again, this is not required. I have to say this again. It's not required for Lab 4. Nowhere in it do I ask for this to be done. So that's why, again, there is no in-class exercise related to this part. Okay, all right. That's enough of that. Let's go back to this for a second. So that's what we did. This whole last piece basically talks about how to configure. It gives you the same stuff if you're interested. So there's some documentation of how this looks. So if you really wanted to, all that stuff would be right here for you to use for the most part. Okay, but what I wanted to also talk about today really briefly is what I said up here at the top, which is I want to talk about Lab 4 before we go. So let's bring that up. And Lab 4, you're mostly done. If you follow along with this series of videos that I've done for you, there's not a lot for you to do, truly. All right. And some people asked me last time when they were doing their lab, they're like, so there's nothing really for me to do, just add in my own stuff, my own content. Yeah. If you follow along with the in-class exercises, it'd be easy for you to do, right? If you don't follow along with the in-class exercise, this would be very difficult for you to do at the last minute, right? So that's why it's good to follow along. And trying to cram to get all this done ahead of time is, in my opinion, really difficult. So what do you need to do that we haven't done already is what I want to go over. So one of them is this part, your personal portfolio piece. All your content, you can lift this from what you already have, right? So this is part of what you do. This 10 marks here, a lot of this is coming from what you already built for me this semester, okay? When we did a non-Node.js backend. That goes all the way down to here. All those pages and everything else I've asked you for, you pretty much have all this stuff. The Express server site structure, well, this is pretty much done too. There's nothing for you to do here. If you follow along in my in-class exercise, then this is done for you. MongoDB, this is where you have to have your own, okay? So please do not use my MongoDB server. That's not the exercise. Even though I've given you the information and the videos, please make your own. Okay, so make your own cloud server. That's something that is your thing to do. But a lot of this stuff where we installed Mongoose and the contact schema and all this other stuff and make an auth guard, this part's all done, right? So there's nothing for you here to do other than go through the exercise that we did together. All right, so that's this part. And then in the server-side routing piece, this is all done. We did all this together inside of our in-class exercises that we've done over the last several weeks. Site security and all that kind of stuff, well, this is all done, right? We kind of did all these together, registration views, the display name. Oh yeah, there is one piece here that actually shows your display name on the nav bar. That piece is for you to do. There's a piece here that tells you this. On the nav bar, it says when you have your login, view, and register, and all that kind of stuff, if the user is authenticated, it tells you right here. One thing that is, no, actually, no, I think actually you're good. I don't think it says that anymore. And the business contact list view, you got all that. We did that together. That was done over the entire semester. We built this contact list view together, right? For the most part. So the details on how to do that, the information and all that stuff is pretty good. A secure area. So in the update view or the edit view, doesn't matter if it's update view or edit view for me. We've done this already, right? So what's left for you to do? Well, you have to do an internal documentation piece where your student ID and all that stuff is done. If you put everything together, putting it all together is what you need to do. Version control, that's on you. You know, give me your list, your item. Now, cloud hosting, that's on you. So you have to make your live site work. So where you can lose marks are things like your CSS layout not working, images not working, all that stuff not working on your cloud host. You need to put this cloud host together. It can't be my cloud host. It's got to be your site that you're showing me, not mine. So this is something that is your own. Your demo video is some work for you to do to put together a demo video of demoing your site, talking about your code a little bit and how you included the in-class exercises. So that's something that you need to put together. So really there's three pieces that we should talk about. One of them is make your own MongoDB Atlas database on the back end. That's a piece for you to do, right? That's some work. Then you have to put together you have to kind of serve everything up on Heroku. That's for you to do. That's a piece. Your video, your internal documentation, your GitHub link, for the most part, is yours. And then the last part is all the content for the pages, the About Me page, the projects page, and all that stuff. Those things are yours. But the actual backend, the Express, and all that configuration we talked about here, if you follow the in-class exercise, it's mostly done. So it's not as bad as you may have thought. If you thought it was bad, it's not terrible at all. All right, any questions for me before we go for the day and we sign off from this semester and say goodbye for now? Guys, thank you so much then. It's been a fantastic semester with you guys. I really appreciate everything else. Shaka will stick around for that. Does it have to be inserted with JS? No, it does not. No. Site content, if you look at the requirements, so that's a good question. Sorry. So Shaka had a very good question. And let me bring that up here. So one thing that if you look at the site content, it says customized logo, blah, blah, and your home page was a welcome message. I don't say anything like that here. I'm not telling you have to insert it. That was for, it was an exercise, a contrived exercise actually, to make you learn how to do document.getElementById, hooking into JavaScript and all that stuff. In reality, we wouldn't do it that way. That's why I said it's not the way we normally do it. We embed it in the page. So this is why in this case, what I'm looking for is just HTML content. That's why it's only worth 10 marks. Okay, so there's nothing you can do. You don't have to put in JavaScript here. It's you just putting in the data. Thank you for that. But anyways, what I was going to say was, guys, thank you. It's been a great semester. I think there's been a lot of really good. Tom, give me 1 second. I'll answer that. There's been some really great stuff that I've seen from you guys as well. And I'm hoping that this has been informative for you and given you a, kind of a direction if you're interested in being a web application developer. This is great stuff because JavaScript is everywhere. JavaScript is the language of the web. And I think you've seen now everything from the front end, JavaScript. Then we've attached TypeScript to make it more interactive and better tooling. That's what we've done this semester. Then we talked about, MongoDB, where JavaScript is on the back end on the database, and we've also talked about Node.js and Express, where JavaScript is also on the server side to replace something like PHP. All right, so those things are really awesome, and I think once you know JavaScript, that whole environment, that whole ecosystem, it makes it more accessible to you as a developer, and it's the way things are going, at least right now, in terms of how we develop applications for the web, modern applications. All right, so Tom had a question, and I'll address it with him before he takes off. Otherwise, does anyone else have any comments or questions? Thank you so much, Muzam. I'm glad you did. Thank you, everybody, for who's here. I appreciate your effort, the time you came out. Jackie, you've always, for the most part, you came out. Calvin, thank you, and Ashok, and everyone else that came out. Nick, today, you guys make my classes better because I have a chance to talk to somebody in this ever disconnected world in COVID, and it was amazing that I had a chance to kind of bounce ideas and work with you guys on this really cool technology. All right, so thank you so much, guys, and I'm going to stop recording now. Good luck on your semester, and if you're taking a summer semester, good luck. If you're not, in the fall, then continue. Some of you also might be going in different directions, so good luck on that, and stay connected with me on LinkedIn. We can keep connected. Otherwise, enjoy the summer, and we'll see each other soon. All right. Thanks, Jackie.